Right. That was louder than you expected, wasn't it? Right, it's 10 past. It's no good hanging around. So we've got 40 minutes, and I've been thoroughly briefed about red and yellow pieces of paper going to be waved at me. These are the red and yellow pieces of paper. If you see these and I haven't spotted them, because that could happen, if you all do that, and then I'll know, and it won't run over, I hope. Now, there's the outside chance that somebody might turn up with a clicker, and if they do, great. We can carry on in this format. If they don't, I'm going to stand over there. So it kind of, I don't know. Oh, Kevin Bartle, one of life's heroes, an extraordinary human being. Don't leave home without one. I'm in a very cavalier fashion here. I'm going to assume that I know what the Swedish means. And hell, yeah, works. Okay, so the focus of what I want to talk to you about this afternoon. Sorry, I've got a wiring issue. Is the idea that it may, against all reason and expectation, be possible if we recalibrate what we typically do in classrooms. It might be possible for all children to experience success in a meaningful way. I think currently they don't. I don't know whether that's your experience. But these are 4 questions that I think every teacher needs to be able to answer for themselves every lesson. The first of them is relatively straightforward. How do I know that every student in my lesson is paying attention? Now, I want to be absolutely clear that what I'm doing right now is not teaching. And the reason I'm not teaching is that you're too big an audience. And so one of my issues that I would have were I to try and teach you is that I would have no meaningful way to be able to answer this question. I wouldn't know. I'd be able to see. I can see what you're doing. I can see there's a little bit of whispering up there. And I can see if you're kind of nodding and smiling and being polite. But I have no meaningful way of checking that anything that I say or do has been focused on. So that's the first thing. How do I do that? The second thing is this. How do I know that you're all making... And this is harder. This takes a different set of strategies to be able to answer this. And this is something I'm really not going to be able to do today. So I can take visual cues as to whether I think you're paying attention. You know, for instance, I can see Ben Newmark on his laptop, and there's no way he's paying attention, you know, for instance. But the idea that I could in some way peer inside your minds and check that you've all understood what I'm going to say to you is obviously absurd. But there are things that I might be able to do in a classroom that would make that more possible, to allow me to give me an imperfect view of what was going on in children's mind. The third question, which we have not even the vaguest hope of me being able to answer today, is how do I know that children are getting better at the things I want them to get better at? How do I know they're mastering the skills that over time I'm teaching? So this would be particularly meaningless for me to try and assess this, because it would involve me following you around in your place of work in sort of an annoying fashion. I won't be doing that. But I think as a teacher, it's a really important question. The fourth one, and this is the one we're really going to focus on for most of this talk, is this one. How can I do all of these things in a way which is inclusive rather than exclusive, that is mindful of the fact that all children should be able to experience success, that they have a right to it, and that if my answers to these questions reveal that there's a minority of students who aren't doing those things. What am I going to do about that? So how do I do it? So that's the focus. So these 4 questions are really important. This 4th one is the focus of today. So briefly have a think about why children struggle. And there's all sorts of long, complex reasons for this, which are well outside the scope of today's talk. But the one that I particularly want to focus on is the one that I think we have most agency over as teachers. So I've got a couple of quotes for you. And this first one comes from a New Zealand professor of education, a late New Zealand professor of education, Graham Nussel, now sadly deceased. And in a wonderful book that he wrote some years ago called The Hidden Lives of Learners, he made this observation that when I first read it, really stopped me in my tracks. And that he said that ability is the consequence, not the cause of what children experience in the classroom. So we typically think the opposite. We typically think that children's ability, their intelligence, causes them to learn more or less. And his argument was that's not the case, that their ability is caused by what we do with them in the classroom. So that's quite a challenging idea, quite an interesting idea. The same idea expressed differently here by, again, another dead white man, this time an American, Seafried Engelman, who said that the curriculum determines the extent to which children are clever, are smart, are intelligent. And so I think that both of those educationalists are trying to get at the same idea differently, that how well kids do, whether or not they experience success in the classroom, is to an important extent governed by the choices that we make in the classroom. I know. So, this isn't a quote, this is me, this is what I reckon, so I'm not quoting anyone else, but it's a thing that I think. But I want to unpack it a little bit because it comes with a couple of caveats. So I'm not dismissing the fact that there are enormous and profound differences between the children that we teach, but I think most of those differences are ones that we can't do anything about as teachers. We can't do anything about their social backgrounds. We can't do anything about their genetic makeup. What we can do something about is the experiences that they have in our classrooms. And so to that extent, my argument is that the most important difference between children is what's in their heads, the quality and the quantity of what they know. Does that make sense? Okay, right. So this is my proposition today. That when children struggle, when they can't do things, it's revealed that they've performed poorly on a test or they can't answer a question, that occurs because we have left a gap, a space in our instruction, and they've fallen into that gap. So that when children struggle, it's because of a fault, a missing piece in the teaching sequence. If that proposition's true, the implication is that children failing to make progress is our responsibility. It's not your fault, but neither is it their fault. Now, it might be the case that there are some children who set their face against the idea of doing well at school. Maybe they don't come in, maybe they behave very, very badly. All of those things are possible. But what I'm thinking about here, there's one particular boy that I taught some years ago who lives with me. No, literally, he doesn't live with me. He lives in my mind. It'd be weird if he lived with me. He'd probably be about 30 now. Anyway, he was a really, really hard-working, diligent student. And I would give him a task, and he would drip with concentration and effort, and he would fail. And, I'd say, read this, answer these questions. Everyone else would have finished. He was still labouring at the first question, trying his best. Never made any progress. Used to break my heart. But what I'd say to myself was, well, I tried my best. What can you do with kids like that? And I would offload the responsibility onto him. It never occurred to him, to me, or him maybe, that the responsibility ought to be mine. So the solution that I'm offering is I'm calling gapless instruction. The idea, and it's a mythical, probably unachievable perfection, is that we ought to strive to not leave any gaps in our teaching. We probably can't. We probably never find them all for all students. But we should have a gap-finding mentality. We should take on board, embrace the responsibility that if children aren't making progress, it's because there might be gaps. Even if that's not true, it's a useful fiction. It's the only real alternative is to blame students, and you'll never get anywhere with that. So what I'd like to suggest is that it's an empowering way to think about teaching. That it's a way in which we can take control. Rather than thinking, I've tried my best, clearly, I might believe that, but clearly I've left a gap. Clearly there is some space between what's in my mind and what's in his, and we haven't bridged that gap. We haven't found a way through. So so there are three principles that underpin. This is very much a big picture introductory talk, which is about the principles rather than about the nitty-gritty of what this might look like in the classroom. That would be a different talk. And we haven't got time for it today, unfortunately. These are the principles. So the first one we've kind of covered. And I think but this isn't something just to sort of look at and nod. This is a way of life. This is taking on board the ongoing responsibility for children not meeting our expectations and thinking, how can I do it in another way that might reach them? So I think that's really, really important. The second is to think carefully about the relationship between success and struggle. That we want children to be able to do progressively more difficult things and to deal with more complex ideas as their education progresses. But it's the observation that nobody persists without the experience of success. So if you think about your own lives, everything that you received unambiguous feedback that you were bad at, you've quit. And you've done that so that you can focus on the things you're better at. So successful adults are strategic quitters. We've given up on so it's relatively rare as adults to deliberately do things that we're not very good at. We avoid that. So in that case, in that respect, we're very poor role models for students, because we're saying, you can't do what I've done yet. You have to carry on struggling. But I think the other part of this is that, and I don't know whether this is the case in Sweden, but there's been a vogue over the years, a fashion for the idea that failure is good for people. It builds resilience. Have you come across that idea? So what I'd like to say to you is failure might be good for someone who's experienced lots and lots of success. But another failure, for someone who's only ever experienced failure, is never, ever going to be even vaguely useful to them. That the ability to struggle is predicated on a firm foundation of success. So in order for gapless instruction to work, we have to make children succeed and believe that further success is possible. And then the third principle is all around the conditions for practice. So one of my observations from visiting schools, visiting classrooms, working with teachers is that an extraordinary amount of practice that takes place in schools is bad practice. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So those are the principles. So we're going to go through them bit by bit. Here's the first one again. So we're now familiar with that. So just to unpack that a little bit. So one of the things is it can be kind of hard sometimes to know if we're any good at teaching. Because how well students do can be misleading. So children who are lucky, who are from socially advantaged backgrounds, who've won the intelligence lottery, those children are likely to be successful no matter what. And often, and I'm reflecting on my own experiences here, often despite my actions. Sometimes I've been doing something which they've been able to ignore. And goes, that's rubbish, I'll just do this instead and I'll be fine. And they have the wherewithal to be successful despite their teachers. I remember once speaking to a head teacher of a selective school who said in one particular year the subject that had the best exam results was one for which there was no teacher. That they'd said, I know, they'd said it was a boys' school, they'd said to the boys, look, if you're going to choose this subject, there is no teacher, you'll have to teach yourselves. And they went, okay. And they were very, very bright, motivated children. And we were talking about this, and he was saying, well, what useful information can I take from the fact that does that mean teachers make things worse? Obviously not. Obviously not. They were a very skewed sample of students. And that is not likely to be replicated with most children in most schools. So, but it's an extreme example of this idea. And the corollary of that, and it's something which I was pathologically blind to for years as a teacher, was that I would say to myself, well, I must be doing a good job because some children have done well. What about the ones who haven't? Well, I tried my best. What can you do with kids like that? And I didn't look at the fact that the children who weren't succeeding were the ones who needed me to get it right most. The ones from the most disadvantaged cohorts, the ones with the least academic advantages. And so those children are only likely to be successful if you get things right. Their success is probably because of their teachers. So if we're trying to establish whether or not what we're doing is effective, that's the group that we should look at. Which is uncomfortable. But it leads to this idea that if you are able to align your teaching approach, your curriculum, to the success of the least advantaged students, if those children are going to be successful, what benefits those children will benefit everybody. But those children, their need is disproportionate. They need us to get it right. The other children, doesn't matter. They can be successful despite us. But if we get it right for those children, we can get it right for everyone, is the argument. So, thinking back to that lad, the diligent lad, trying his best, not making any progress, and I'm using him as a sort of exemplar in my mind, to think about this question: what if there are children whose experience of school is that they're present, they're in your lesson, day after day, trying, but not making any progress? Why does that happen? And I think there are several possible answers to that, but the ones that I want to focus on is the quality of the curriculum and its implementation. So I think specificity, which is quite hard to say. It really gives you a full mouth workout. Specificity. So if we're not specific, to a greater or lesser extent, we're vague. And if we're vague, we're going to be leaving gaps. Not being systematic, not thinking enough about what comes in what order and how often we re-encounter things that are going to be really important. And also thinking about being sensitive to the way different subjects are learned. Because we learn different subjects differently. And there's the global truth that broadly the way human beings learn is pretty much the same. But the way we all learn different subjects is all similarly different, if that makes sense. So being aware of that, I think, is important. So we've talked, it's coming up in the wrong order, I don't know. So this is essentially the point that I've been making here, that if we want to know if we're effective, we need to look at those disadvantaged cohorts. But we should also think carefully about the way in which we design assessments. And again, this is a much bigger topic than the scope of this talk allows for. But I think certainly in England, the way we design assessment internally within schools is almost always has the result of actually making it harder to be an effective teacher, because it gives us skewed information. It gives us it tells us that some children did well and some children did badly. It doesn't point out that a lot of the children that did well often did well despite us, and it conceals the fact that some children who didn't do well because of us. And that's partly because a lot of assessment assesses children's ability to do things that nobody has ever taught them to do. And I think that, certainly in English schools, that is endemic. It's the norm. And it's less the case in some subjects than others. So in subjects like mathematics, that's less the case. There are areas of math teaching that I think children aren't routinely taught, like things like how to use a calculator, how to use a protractor. Those things are not necessarily routinely taught well, but how to compute an algebraic equation, those things tend to be taught step by step and in a way which allows children to be successful. But you take a subject like my subject, which is English, that most of the assessment of English assesses children's ability to comprehend through extended writing, through writing essays, before anyone's ever taught them how to write an essay. And so some children work that out for themselves, they do it despite us, and some children can't do it because we didn't teach it. So we look at the results and they tell us nothing useful. So, what do they tell us? So, most of the assessment that takes place in schools is discriminatory. And what I mean by that is that it is designed to discriminate between children. To say some children are better at this subject than other children. That's what most assessment is designed to do. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that's its function, is to have a discrimination. And so things like employers like that, because they get to find out, oh, this child, this human being has a piece of paper which says they're better than other children at these things, therefore they might make a better employee. And so we start making inferences which are wildly unsupported by the data, but there's nothing per se wrong with discriminatory assessment. I'm not using the word to mean bad. So this is how discriminatory assessment works. You take an average cohort, you give them the assessment, and you'd get a normal distribution curve of results. That's what they're designed to do. Input in, input out. And what this tells you as a teacher, if you replicate one of these assessments in your school, in your classroom, it tells you the really shocking truth that some children are better at your subject than others. You'd never have worked that out without that assessment. And so it's not that that's valueless knowing that, but it has very limited value. What I'm going to suggest instead is that if you want to know whether your curriculum is any good, whether your approach to teaching is effective, you need to use mastery assessment. And mastery assessment works like this. You take a normal distribution of children, you give them an assessment, and it is designed so that there's the possibility of all students being able to achieve 100%. They never will. Don't worry about that. But it's designed in that way. Again, there's a lot of, I'm glossing over a lot of detail about exactly what you would have to change in an assessment for this to be true, but it's absolutely possible to do this. And then the inferences we then draw from this assessment, if a child hasn't been able to answer a question, that's our responsibility. What did I get wrong in the teaching of this concept? Did I give them enough practice in my classroom to be able to do this unprompted? If the answer to those things is no, then I can take responsibility meaningfully for that. I can also compare if other teachers have taken a similar assessment or children have taken a similar assessment in different years. I can look at what seems to be. So if one child can't do something, that's still something I'm going to take responsibility for. But if I find that all of them are bad at something, then that requires I go back to the drawing board and think carefully about what's happened. So it's a very, very different mindset, but it's an essential one for being a gap finder. If you don't assess like this, I don't believe you can teach effectively. So in terms of what this looks like in the classroom, because I've made it sound a bit scary and complicated, it could be as straightforward as this. So, I've taught something, I ask you a question about the thing I've taught, and then I ask myself, did everybody get it right? And if the answer to that question is no, the next question I need to ask is, did anybody get it right? And if the answer to that is no, then that's obviously my responsibility, isn't it? If I've taught something and no one can do it, I have to take responsibility for that. But let's go back a step. Did any of the students get it right? Yes, some did. Some did. Few. How many? So, did most of them? I don't know whether it's how popular it is in Sweden, but in England, Rosenshine's principles of instruction are very popular. Have you come across those? One of the things that Rosenshine talks about is getting a high success rate, which he says is about 80%. I've got a little bit of an issue with that, because I think if 80% of your students are getting what you've just taught right, that implies that 20% aren't. That's a fifth of your students. If a fifth of your students can't do what you need them to do, I don't think we should be complacent about that. I don't think that's anywhere near good enough. That's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. So we need to think, how do we do better than 80% is an important question. How much better? It kind of depends. I mean, you know your students to a greater or lesser or degree. Once you've got a clear idea of what's good enough, you know, so if most of them haven't, then that's our responsibility. If most of them did, great. They're probably going to forget it over time, and that's fine. We know that. But good for now. Back to the first question, did they all get it right? They did. They all got it right. Hallelujah. The next question is this the first time? Is it a one-off? If they've all got it right on multiple occasions, if they've got it right before, that's different. So if they haven't got it right before, if this is the first time, I'm going to expect that to be fairly superficial and not last very long. If they've got it right on multiple occasions, I can feel pretty pleased with the way things are going. So that's the sort of that's the kind of the schema I'd have in my mind in the classroom, thinking about the way I'm interacting with students. And just to go back to the thing I said at the beginning, I'm not teaching you, I'm just talking. If you're not assessing, you're not teaching. And I'm not assessing you. Okay. So, second principle, the idea of success and struggle. So what we've got here is a continuum. This, obviously, a sat-nav. By the way, Sat-nav is the perfect assessment for learning machine. It knows exactly where you are in your learning journey. You tell it your learning goal, and it gives you step-by-step explicit instructions on how to achieve the goal. If you make a mistake, it says, don't worry, we can do it differently. And it's great. The difficulty, as a metaphor, I mean, this works well in life. We don't need to unless when the zombie apocalypse comes and we've got out of the habit of using maps, that could be a problem. But for the most part, it doesn't matter. We can just use sat-navs to find our way around, as I did to get to the hotel, from the hotel to here this morning. The consequence is, because it's so easy to use, I don't put much effort into learning the route. So it's a great way to build success. It's a great way to make people feel like a successful navigators, because you reach your goal. And that's what we need first. But at a certain point, once there is experience of success in the classroom, we have to take away our sat-nav, your support, and we have to encourage students to internalize the things that we want them to learn, and that requires us to teach slightly differently, to think slightly differently, to take away some of the support. Instead of giving answers, to give clues, to say things like, what did we do last time? So they have to think. But that's only going to work if you ask children to do that who haven't experienced success. They won't. They'll collapse often. What they'll learn is, I'm rubbish. I'm bad at school. I'm not good at your lesson. I hate school. I hate you. That's what they'll learn. We don't want that. So I'm just going to gloss this bit because it's kind of connected to what we did at the beginning, and I'm mindful of time. I'm just going to finish off by talking about practice. So again, I think there are 3 things to be mindful about with practice. My mum said to me as a young boy, when I wanted to not do things that she thought were important, she'd say, David, practice makes perfect. Do you have a similar saying? Yeah, well, it turns out she's wrong. And I've taken great delight in telling her this. Only perfect practice makes perfect. This became really vividly clear to me some years ago. I wanted to improve my ability to play tennis. And I don't know why you're laughing. Rude. I'd acknowledged that watching Wimbledon once a year wasn't going to make me any better. So I employed a tennis coach. The very first lesson, the coach said to me, "You're holding the racket wrong," and proceeded to correct my grip. And that made me worse at tennis, because it was hard trying to play with the new grip that I wasn't used to. The problem I had was I'd spent years holding the racket incorrectly. I'd become superb at doing it badly. And that happens lesson in, lesson out, day in, day out for students. So one of the equivalent observations for students is I'm regularly struck by the fact that they don't use capital letters. Yeah? So, right. And so I used to think, God, they're so lazy. They can't be bothered to use capital letters. Oh. But actually, they're no more lazy than I am. Like, it is possible for me to write my name without capital letters, but it takes an effort. I have to think about it. I can do it, but it's effortful. It's exactly the same for them. They know how to use capital letters, but they're not practiced. So you say to them, "Oh, you didn't use capital letter. I've circled where you missed them." They go, "Thanks. It's just the way I write." And they're absolutely correct. They have become, as I had with holding my tennis racket wrongly, they've become superb at not using capital letters. It's effortless for them. And that's because we allow them to practice badly. So That's one ingredient. I've got ahead of myself. I got excited about that story, and I wanted to. I know, it's easily done. There's only 5 minutes left though, so I have to concentrate. So less than that, because I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, so this idea of doing less for longer. Do you have an equivalent of the Couch to 5K exercise program in Sweden? Yes, some people no, don't know what you're talking about. So in England, there is the NHS has created an app which the promise is that they can take anybody from being a couch potato, from someone who can't run, in 9 weeks, from being a couch potato to being able to run 5 kilometres without pausing. I know. So how does it work? So I don't know if any of you in the past have tried and thought to yourself, I'm going to get fitter, I'm going to start running, and you've gone out and you've run and you've got puffed really quickly and you've then been sick in the street and you've gone, I'm not doing that again. You've done that. Yeah. So that's what we routinely ask children to do. Are you able, we say to them, we want you to do the equivalent of a 5 kilometre run in my lesson. Go. Some of them can, lucky them. Some of them can't, fail, embed their feeling of being failures, hate school, so on and so forth. What the Couch to 5K exercise app does is say, session 1, you're going to run for 60 seconds. Then you're going to walk for 90 seconds, and you're going to do another minute's running. And you might get to the end of the half an hour session and feel exhausted, but the vast majority of people can do it. And slowly, over the 9 weeks, you start to believe, maybe I can do this. Maybe it's possible. And then for most people who follow the program, they can do it. And I think we need to take a similar approach the way we do practice in schools. How do we do the equivalent of 60-second runs? Meaningful equivalents of 60-second runs. So for me, as an English teacher, I'd be concentrating on students writing really high-quality sentences rather than high-quality pieces of extended writing, which are going to exhaust them because they don't have the stamina, because they aren't able to write good sentences yet. So I'm going to practice doing less, shorter things for a longer period, because if they get the sentence correct, and they get confident at that, become successful at that, it will enable them to do more difficult things, and we can build up and build up and build up. That's the idea there. The second one is what I've just talked about, the idea that it's routine for practice to embed error. When I look at exercise books in schools, I routinely go through these books, and they're full of terrible writing, really poor quality writing, and students write badly, and then we say, you've got an exam, we need you to write well. I know, thank you. And then the final thing is the idea of over-practicing. Don't practice until somebody can do something. Continue practicing until the idea of being unable to do it becomes inconceivable, becomes so second nature, so routine. And that's where I got to with my tennis grip. I can now hold a racket correctly. I'm still not very good at tennis, but you knew that. So just to finish off, firstly, I think this is really, really important idea to bat about and think about, that what we do, the choices we make, to some extent anyway, to a large extent possibly, determine students' ability. We have a grave and important responsibility in that respect. If you're not using mastery assessment in some form, and you saw me sort of run through the flow chart, if you're not doing that kind of thing, then you have no idea whether or not what you're doing is any good. None. You're guessing. So it's really important, I think. Students' failures shouldn't be, one of the difficulties I sometimes have modelling this and talking to teachers about it, is they feel very scared of teaching in a way which reveals that kids don't know things and can't do things. And they're like, oh, what will people say if the children... But the alternative is you don't know. Not knowing is never better. And so knowing that students have failed to do something is brilliant, because it gives you an opportunity to, like, how can I improve? How can I teach better? How can I engineer practice so that they don't embed mistakes and so on? Once they have that foundation of success, they need to experience struggle. It's kind and important and responsible to start inducing struggle, because otherwise they won't internalize what's important. And then finally, being an effective teacher is about finding and correcting our errors in teaching. That the errors children make shouldn't, for the most part, be surprising. They should be fairly predictable. Occasionally children will make a really rare mistake and I'll think, oh, I've never seen that before, but it's very rare. Most of the mistakes they make are ones that I've seen a lot. So therefore, I ought to have some corrective remedies that I can deploy to ensure that they don't keep making them. Anyway, look, I hope we're done. I hope that you found some of that interesting and useful. If you didn't, I'm really sorry. I tried my best, but thanks ever so much.